Microphones never work for me. Is this microphone working for me? Okay, that's good. So my name is Martin Tyson, and I'm the head of casework for Oscar. So the teams that I look after, they deal with registration of new charities. They deal with charities making changes to themselves. And I also look after the team that deals with our inquiries where there's problems or issues within charities. So that's where I come from. So what I'm wanting to talk about today are the things that make for a strong charity, the things that make for a charity that's run in the most resilient way possible. Now, just thinking about what resilience means, it's one of these words that gets used quite a lot nowadays. It's a charity that can cope with change, a charity that can deal with trouble if and when it comes, because things do happen, things don't always run smoothly, and the more complex, the more challenging the area that you're working in, the more likely it is that you're going to have to deal with difficult things. Is your charity in a state? Does it have the structures where it can deal with those things? And is your charity in a state where, when bad things happen, it can bounce back? That's the essence of resilience. So I'm wanting to talk about some of the things that make for resilience, that make for a strong charity. So, one of the things I want to talk about is where trustees are aware of their duties. Legally, what do you need to do? What help does the law give you in making the tough decisions, or even the not tough decisions? A resilient charity applies good governance. And that's a reasonably easy thing to say. What does it mean? Well, there's been some really good work done in the sector over the past wee while that talks about what good governance means, and I'm going to take you through a bit of that. It looks after its beneficiaries, and it looks after its staff. It behaves appropriately to them, it looks after them, it knows, it works for what's in their best interests. And it's aware of the external factors that influence its work. What are the things happening outside that might adversely affect it, that might positively affect it, and it plans to deal with those. So I want to talk about aspects of all those things just this afternoon. So, trustee duties. This is the stuff that's in the Charities and Trustee Investment Scotland Act 2005. That all sounds very official, very legalese, but at the heart of it, it's a very simple idea. As a trustee, you've got to act in the best interests of the charity, and that is the fundamental test that we want to be sure that you're applying, that you need to apply when you've got a decision to make. Is this in the best interest of the charity, or is it not? Now, the Act's quite helpful in unpacking a little bit what that means. So, oops, that was a bad thing to do. Okay, what's an acting in the best interest of the charity? It means you need to act in furtherance of the charity's purposes. What was it set up for? Here's what it's set up for. The stuff that you do needs to further that purpose. That's what it's for. And if you're doing activity, if you're spending money that isn't in furtherance of that purpose, why? You need to be asking yourself that all the time. You need to act with care and diligence. You need to take advice. We were talking about that just now. Where you need to, and follow that advice where it's appropriate. You need to make sure that you have all the information that you need to take a decision, and you need to show that you've considered options and thought through the decisions that you're making properly. And you need to manage any conflict of interest between your interests and the interests of the charity, or the interests of someone who's appointed you to the charity and the interests of the charity where there's a conflict there. So those are the key things that explain what it is to act in the best interests of the charity. There's some other duties there that are specific things that the 2005 Act says that you have to do as a charity trustee, or that a charity has to do. Most of those are to do with transparency. It's all that agenda that Maureen's talking about of helping people to have trust in charities, telling people what you're doing, telling people about the charity, making clear what it's for, what it's about and what it's doing. So you need to update your details on the Scottish Charity Register, make sure they're up to date. If things change, make sure the register changes. You need to report to OSCA or ask our consent when you're making changes to your charity. You need to submit accounts and annual return to OSCA. You need to make sure that you comply with the fundraising regulations and legislation, and you need to provide information to the public about your charitable status. If you're a SCIO, you need to tell the public that you're a SCIO. So those are the duties. Moving on from that into, what is that? What is it to run a charity? What is it to run a charity well? And that's about good governance. And recently there's been published a Scottish governance code for the third sector. This is something that has been produced within the sector. We were involved in that, but it's been produced by people within the sector. And what it does, thinking about what Maureen had to say about the structure of the sector in Scotland, about the size of charities within the sector, it doesn't set out very sort of detailed rules or how to do things. What it does is set out the core principles and the key elements of good governance for charities in Scotland. And then it's what that lets you do is apply those to the needs and the activities of the size of charity and the type of charity that you have. So let's look a little bit closer at those. There's 5 core principles: organisational purpose, leadership, board behaviour, control and effectiveness. And I want to talk a little bit about all of those, and without going too much into detail or telling too many war stories, talk a little bit about that in terms of the perspective that we have from our casework and our knowledge of how things can go in charities. So, organisational purpose. A charity's purposes are what the charity's been set up to achieve, and that's the reason the charity exists. And as we talked, this is something that has a very direct link into the duties under the law. Charity trustees have to make sure the charity acts in furtherance of its purpose. Now, that seems kind of obvious, but it doesn't always work out like that. It's sometimes difficult, and one of the key things is to understand the purpose. And it's interesting thinking about the perspective of the folks in my team on that. One end of the team, they're dealing with charities that are just starting. They're dealing with charities that are registering. And they have a reasonable, they've just thought about their purposes, hopefully. Sometimes we're having a bit of dialogue with them about those purposes, whether they're charitable, whether they're understandable or not. So they're reasonably fresh in people's minds. Looking a bit further on, when we're dealing with charities where there are issues, where things have been raised with us, sometimes people are a bit less familiar with their purposes. It becomes a bit less immediate in people's minds. So there is that requirement to stay familiar with your purpose, to understand your purpose, and think about whether it's still appropriate. Work to your governing document. That again sounds obvious. In practice, it isn't always. There is a tendency for charities, as they get through their life, to put the Constitution in a drawer and sometimes not to look at it for long periods of time. We will deal with a fair few phone calls and emails every year where we have charities saying, can you give us a copy of our Constitution? We don't have one. That does happen. I'm sure it's not happened to anyone here. But it is vital to keep familiar as a charity trustee with your governing document. If it's not right, if it doesn't do the job for you, if it's getting in the way, then think about reviewing it, think about changing it. But you need to make your decisions, the key thing, make your decisions in line with the purpose that's in that governing document. You need to use your resources to meet the aims. And once you've done that, tell people about it. Again, that point about transparency. You need to blow your own trumpet. You need to say, what is it we've done to achieve our purposes? What is it we've done with our money? What is it we've done with our resources? That's where the annual report comes in, your website, talking to people, the way that you communicate with people outside the charity, really important. Leadership. So a well-run board, it's clear about its roles and responsibilities, provides strategic direction in line with the purpose, but in line with the visions and the values. And that's an interesting one, how to lead an organisation. I think one of the things is you've got to be the organisation's values. If you are a charity that's been set up to, I don't know, combat bullying in schools or in workplaces, and there's bullying going on in your charity, that's not going to work very well. And that does happen. I think there are examples of that. You need to have a culture within the organisation that embeds its vision and its values. You need to understand the roles and responsibilities of the board, and some of that will depend on how big the organisation is and what it does. Again, looking back at the profile of the sector that Maureen showed there, we've got a lot of small charities where there won't be employees, there may be some volunteers, but sometimes the trustees will be all there is, so they will be quite close to the activities of the charity. As things move up the scale in terms of size and income, it becomes more complex, and the relationship of the charity trustees to staff, to volunteers and to the activities of the charity, that becomes a little bit more complex. So you need to think about it in terms of the size of charity you have. What's it appropriate for the board to be involved in? The question you should be asking yourself is, as a charity trustee, is what do I need to be involved in? What should I know? What decisions should I be making? What should we be leaving to other people and delegating? One key thing, promote equality and diversity. Make sure that people are treated fairly, that you're keeping to the law on equality and diversity, and thinking about the charity's reputation, its values and its culture, and how far equality and diversity are reflected in those. You then scrutinise information on activities and achievements, and we'll talk a little bit about that, more about that later. But it's about thinking about what the role of the charity trustees in, given the size of your organisation. What do you need to know? Are you getting to know what you need to know? And again, that point about delegating tasks when it's appropriate. What do you need to do as charity trustees, and what's it better for volunteers to do and for staff to do? How far do you need to be involved in the day-to-day activities of the charity? How far is your job a more strategic one? And that will depend on the nature of the activities and on the size of the charity. But the strategic piece will always be there for charity trustees. You're always there to make the big decisions. How much you're involved in the day-to-day will depend on the scale of the charity. Board behaviour. And in terms of what we see when we're looking at charities in inquiries and investigations, this can be the really key one. How people treat each other. A well-run board, collectively and individually, is one where people show mutual respect, where there's integrity, where there's openness, and where there's a degree of challenge. So you need to make sure that behaviour is consistent with your vision and values. That's that point that I made before. You need to be transparent, open and accountable. So that's transparent, open and accountable to the public, to your beneficiaries, to the people that fund you, but also to each other. And sometimes it's surprising where the Chinese walls can be among charity trustees and within charities. You need to be open and accountable to each other and with each other. You need to listen to each other, you need to listen to your beneficiaries, listen to your staff. What that means will depend on what you do, and on the scale of your charity, what that can involve. Handle concerns and complaints correctly. The more activity you do, the more things are likely to go wrong. That happens. The question is how you deal with it. And again, a lot of the business that we get will be stuff that's not particularly for us to deal with. It will be service level complaints from charity users about charities. That's not primarily for us to deal with, and we're probably less likely to get involved in that. That's primarily for charity trustees to think about whether they deal with that themselves, or if the scale of the charity demands it, how those complaints are escalated. But it's in the interests of the charity to deal with complaints and comments appropriately, to take those on board, to make sure they are dealt with and heard. Acknowledging where conflicts of interest may arise. And part of that is recognising conflicts and then dealing with them. But the big issue sometimes is people not realising that they have a conflict, that the other organisation that they're involved with, the decision that they're making also involves that other organisation, and thinking through where that puts them and what they should be doing about that. And I think this is, in a way, it's the most diffuse one, but it's the most important one. Creating a board environment where diverse views are welcomed, where you need a board environment where there isn't one kingpin who what they say goes, where other people get to challenge, where everyone on the board gets to express their view. I think the question to ask yourself there is, when you come out of a charity trustee meeting, did I get to say what I needed to say? Did all the people at that meeting get to say what they needed to say? If the answer to those questions is no, then you need to think about it again. Again, a well-run board will develop and implement appropriate controls to direct and oversee progress and performance of the organisation. That can be very simple in a small organisation. In a big organisation, that can be quite complex, and that will be most of your time. But it's making sure that you get the appropriate information and that you scrutinise it properly. So putting in place the structures, the controls and the processes, regularly reviewing your policy and your procedures, your safeguarding procedures, your recruitment procedures, all of those kind of things. Are they things that are living documents? Are they things that sat in a drawer for 6 years and you've never looked at? Do you put them in place? Making sure your decisions are well informed. What's the basis that you're deciding things on? Do you have the figures? Do you have the numbers? Do you have the information? If not, how are you deciding? Applying appropriate risk management systems. Now, risk is a scary word. It's also something that people sometimes tell you is very complex. It's basically, what are the uncertainties that might stop your charity doing the things that it needs to do in furtherance of its purposes? What are the outside things that might stop it? What are the internal things that might go wrong and might stop you doing the things that you want to do and that you need to do? How can you foresee those? Can you put things in place that will reduce those risks or mitigate the effects if those things come to pass? Sometimes that can be very simple. Sometimes that will involve a lot of complexity, and some risks you won't be able to entirely get rid of. But have you thought about it? Evaluating performance against plans and budgets. So you decide to do something you decided to do something last year. Did it happen? If it didn't happen, what was the reason for that? How do you do it better next year? It's the stuff you'd expect it to do, but I think it's remarkable how often people just go on from year to year without necessarily reviewing things, without thinking about things afresh. And considering whether the legal structure that you've got still works for you. If your charity's grown, if things have changed, if things have moved on, is the way that you're set up still the right structure for you? And effectiveness. And this is bringing all that together, really. So a well-run board understands its role, understands its powers, and it works collectively and proactively to achieve its organisational purpose. I think one of the things there is to think about your board, to think about yourself as a charity trustee. Am I still where I need to be? Am I still in the right place? Have I still got something to contribute here? And thinking about the board as a whole, given where we are now, given what we're doing now, do we have the right people on board? Do we have the right skills? And sometimes those are very difficult conversations to have, those are very difficult thoughts to have, but particularly as things get more challenging, as things change, as things move on from when you set the charity up, are things still right? Do we still have the right people on board? If you have the right people, but people need a bit of development, how do you develop that capability? How do you move on with your skills? Are there particular things that you need to have on the board, and what can you do about those? Thinking about what happens when people retire, move on. Do you know what will happen next? That might be one of your key risks. If you do get fresh people on board, how do you bring them in? How do you get them used to the organisation? How do you let them know what their duties are and how to go about their business? And I think one of the key things here, making sure your meetings have active participation from all. And it comes back to that word collectively that was at the top of that section there. Is everyone involved? Are there people who don't turn up to meetings? Are there people who never say anything at meetings? If so, why is that? Is it because they don't have anything to contribute? Is it because everything's okay? Is it because they feel frightened or reluctant to contribute? Is everyone collectively managing the charity? And I think that issue of collective participation, of everyone being involved in the governance of a charity, I think that's a key thing about the culture in a charity, and I think particularly the culture around the charity trustee table. So, we've got copies of the governance code there. I would say grab one on the way out. It's a really useful resource. We use it a lot. We recommend it to people, and hopefully it's helpful for you in your charity. Okay, thinking about knowing about your duties, I think knowing about some of the risks, just a couple of things to highlight to you. Safeguarding. This is something that came up particularly during last year in the sector, and it's something that we've produced guidance on. Safeguarding is the action that an organisation takes to promote the welfare of children and vulnerable adults to protect them from harm. I think that one of the key things there that you can do as a charity is to think about what your involvement is in that, to think about what that particular issue means for your charity. There may be no implications for your charity depending on what it does, or it may be very central to what your charity does, or there may be implications that you haven't realised because it's only in parts of what your charity does. But it is very much worth thinking about that. There are other issues around that, all the issues around having a safe and secure workplace, about organisational culture, how you treat your people, how you treat your volunteers, and how you treat your employees, and all those employment law issues. It's about culture. We have published some top tips for safeguarding, and I'll go through these. One is to know your charity law duties, acting in the interest of the charity. To know your other statutory duties. Those will depend on the charity, it'll depend on what you do, but you need to know those. Be trained in safeguarding. Know what your duties are, to know what happens, what you do, and what safeguarding is, because there's a surprising amount of uncertainty about that. Manage the risks for your charity. What does it do? What risks are there in what you do to children or to vulnerable adults? Who do you work with? What sort of stuff do you do? If that's something that does apply, have appropriate policies and procedures. Properly implement those policies and procedures. And appropriate means right for the kind of thing that you do and the scale of what you do. Embed safeguarding in culture. have clear policies around raising concerns, and that comes back to that thing about dealing appropriately with complaints and comments and concerns. Deal with any concerns correctly. And part of that, these are difficult things to deal with. If this comes up, it is difficult stuff. The most difficult thing is if you don't know where to start. If it happens and you haven't got a structure in place, if it happens and your people don't know what they're supposed to do, that's when it's most difficult. You can help with that by having clear policies and a clear way of behaving for people. And learn and reflect from incidents if they happen. So, external factors, things you might want to think about. Well, probably ought to think about. Brexit. We're all thinking a lot about Brexit. What does it mean for your charity? It is possible it might mean nothing, depending on what it does. But there are some real things that you ought to be thinking about. Funding. What are your funding streams at the moment? Do any of them come from Europe, whether that's directly or whether it's indirectly through Scottish Government or through local authorities? What does it mean for the labour market? Think about your employees. Do you have employees who are EU nationals? Do they have settled status? What happens to them on 31st October, depending on where we go? Specific sectoral impacts. There's been a lot of talk about the impact on the healthcare sector in terms of availability of drugs and all sorts of factors there. How does that bear on your charity? Human rights. There will be changes in terms of human rights law. There'll also may well be changes in terms of data law, and that depends on what happens. It's worth thinking about those things. There is guidance on our website. Sorry, I'll go back and let you actually see that. Guidance on our website, there's a whole lot of links there to guidance that Scottish Government and other organisations have put out. Have a look at it. None of us know where this is going to go, but the more you think about it, the better you'll be prepared for whatever the exit, whatever, whatever actually happens. Other external factors, fraud and cybercrime. This is fraud that's when trickery is used to gain a dishonest advantage, often financial, over another person. Cybercrime is any criminal act committed by digital means. And thinking back to the slide that Maureen had there about notifiable events, the things that charities tell us about, 24% of those are essentially your financial issues and your reporting your financial misdeeds. It happens. It happens in all sectors. It happens in the charity sector just as much as anywhere else. It's reported to us, and that's one of the key things that we want to be reported to us in terms of the notifiable events regime. But anyone can be a target. Your charity can be a target. So it's worth thinking about being aware of what you need to watch out for, particularly in terms of cybercrime, fake emails, SMS messages, bogus links in emails, ransomware, where someone puts something into your systems and then asks for money to take it off, viruses, data security breaches. It does happen. The sector is vulnerable to that, so make sure you're aware of it. And there's guidance on our website, both on cybercrime and on fraud, and on reducing the risks of fraud in your charity. So, really, following from that, the best preparation for tomorrow is doing your best today. Think about this stuff. You can't foresee everything. Bad things do happen. We understand that. That's why we have the notifiable events regime. The effect of those things will be mitigated if you've thought about it beforehand. And I'm very happy to take some questions.